Hi, this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by. This is viewers' orchid question time. Number 10, I believe. And number 9, if I remember rightly, was so long we had part 1 and part 2. We're not doing that. Hopefully. Some of these are quite short. But you know me. Right, first one is a memory. Trying to remember, if you see what I mean. Maureen asked, have I got any special orchids, e.g. presents or gifts? There are lots of gifts in here, such that since I lost my notes and such things were recorded, I don't even know which ones they are anymore. However, there are some amongst them that I won't forget. One here. This is Dendrobium tortilli, and this was sent from Alberto in Italy, along with my aphyllum. When I made the decision between the aphyllum and the primulinum, as they're very similar, I kept the primulinum because it was a gift from Alberto in Italy. It was a friend, YouTube friend, specifically sent them to me, so those will be remembered and looked after. I've got one up here, lurking up here somewhere as well. Where's it gone? Come down. Ugh. Buried up amongst the Tantalumnias. Now that is a nobly type, that's Dendrobium Comet King, and I know where it came from, but I think the story that goes with that, you all know my holy clay pots. The bulk of those came from a garden centre in Ireland, and Rachel went and collected them for me, took them home to her place, went to all the trouble of packing them up, organising a courier, because Postman Pat wouldn't take them, and to get them over to me. And in the box was this little kiki of Dendrobium Comet King. Now I nearly lost that. That was nearly gone. It was in a bad way, but it managed to push up a cane last year. That's nowhere near a full size, but a good cane nonetheless. And it now has a new growth for this year. So it's going to make it. You know, I've kept it. Lovely blooms on that. And yeah, I mean, an unexpected little insert into a box of pots. So that was that one. One of my Vandas, the orange one, which is it's an Ascasenda really, I suspect, but an Ascasenda is a hybrid between two genera, and intergeneric then in that case, isn't it? They're both Vandaceous, and one of them that wasn't a Vanda was reclassified as Vanda, so it's a Vanda cross with a Vanda, so it's a Vanda. And the orange one with the tightly clustered blooms, that was a present from my daughter Hannah. That's special because at that time she couldn't work. She had to live on state benefits, which is nowhere near enough to live on, quite honestly. So, you know, every penny counted, and she bought that for me for a present when she had no money. And at first I was cross, but so that's special. What else have we got? I mean, this is a gift. Basically, when I went to the Welsh show last year, the speciotic plants. Oh, hang on, kit's coming on. Shows how cool it is today. The fans haven't even come on. They've just come on now, heading towards lunchtime. Anyway, the first time I'd ever met them, I'd only ever bought online many times from their eBay store, and they were there. And I decided to film their display, their sales display, and put it up as a separate video for them. So they sent me a gift, which was this plant, which is this Ancelia africana. So, you know, that was a thank you gift for doing what I was doing anyway. At the end of the day, I'd have filmed their stand. The only difference is, instead of merging it with some of the others, I just separated it out, which they appreciated. Now I'm going to have to start looking and thinking. In fact, I'll probably leave it at that. There's probably a few others lurking around in here. I mean, the big box orchids, I've lost track of which ones they even are now. I can remember most of them, but then there was a big box junior, some of which I remember, but all those are itemised in my notes. That information's been lost, I'm afraid. So, but that was a massive influx of orchids. I forget how many there was in there, but given that quite a few of them had died in the journey because they got sent in the sub-zero temperatures, so things like the oncidiums didn't make it, they didn't come out alive. But most of the dendrobiums hung in there and a couple of other things. Some surprising things, I mean, like this little cattleya here, this came out of the big box. So that survived sub-zero temperatures for days, not just a couple of hours, and has grown on. So there's that lot. Right, I have to go round individually now. Should have prepared, shouldn't I? I don't think there are any others. If I've forgotten anybody, I'm sorry. But as I said, a lot of that information was in my notes and is now gone. So that's that one. Right, the next one, you're in luck. Yusuf Jeewa, I think that might be pronounced it, wanted me to do a spotlight on Dendrobium senile. Well, with the saga of my Dendrobium senile that was going to go into the Orchid Society competition last month and the email got lost, the guy I was chatting with that actually does the newsletter where the pictures and the results would have gone said, would I like to do a spotlight on that for the next newsletter, which is the one coming up soon. So I said, yeah, it's not compensation for missing out on the competition, but it'll do. So I had to do this spotlight anyway. So these are my notes, and these are in note form, so they might come out a bit garbled. I suppose you better have a look at it. Doesn't look much at the moment because it's it's finished blooming and it's coming back into growth. But it's still got a bloom on it, one that came out quite a bit later than the others. Blooms do last well. As dendrobiums go, this is not huge, it's not Latoria long lasting, but pretty long lasting compared with some of the spring bloomers. And at the moment this is coming into growth. I've got quite a lot of new growths coming out in many places, quite honestly. So I mean that's what the plant looks like. That's that. Right, so it's also known as, aka, Whitehead Dendrobium, the old man orchid, and it was once classed as a Callista senile, not senile, but close, a similar word. So it used to be as a Callista. It was first described in 1865, so it's been around a while. It's not a new discovery or anything like that. It's in the Formoseae section, which is the black hair type, which is a bit of a contradiction in terms, really, because it's covered in white hairs, and as far as I know, it's the only one. But it's in that section. As I say, the black hair types. That's an exception to the rule, but it's still in the same section anyway. Others in that section that you may have heard of, Formosum, sorry, I always want to say infundibulum. It's infundibulum, or I'll get told off. You know who you are. And Dendrobium lowii. I've got a cross between those two. I've also got another cross with infundibulum in it. So I have got a few lying around of the Formoseae section. As far as light goes for this, it's relatively tolerant, but it won't stand intense bright light in the summer period when the sun's at its strongest. It can take bright light of winter sun, no problem at all. And spring and autumn, quite bright sun is okay, but as that sun gains its strength, the leaves will burn. And this plant is susceptible to problems, and if it hasn't got any, it can grow really well for you. But if it gets a problem, it can just go down. It's a funny one. It doesn't like anything going wrong. It can tolerate things not quite right, but not actually going wrong. So, yeah. So don't go too mad with the old bright light in the summer. Now temperatures for this one, in my winter goes down to about 12 degrees. This can go down to 10, 9, 8, 7 would be pushing your luck, centigrade obviously. in the modern world. But it would need to be dry to drop to those temperatures in the winter. However, it does get in the wild quite a cool, dry winter. But if you leave this one dry too long, it might not ever come out of your winter rest. It doesn't truly rest. It likes some moisture. And therein lies the place where a lot of people would lose it. Too wet with cold temperatures equals soggy roots. Chances are it won't be growing much, if at all. The roots are rot. And this thing does not like trying to survive without roots. It's not a strong rooter at the best of times. You know, if you see a big, strong, healthy plant, still hasn't got that many roots. So watch your winter. But it can take the cool temperatures. Oh, that was some on the roof, pigeon or something, I expect. Right, where do we get to? Winter. It's not happy above 30 degrees, and the closer you get to 30 degrees, the more important the high humidity becomes. It will tolerate heat, but not without humidity. The leaves are very frail, I'll call them, because that's how I see them. They're fluffy. They're little fluffy, delicate leaves. There's no substance there at all. So you get them hot without humidity and they'll just dehydrate. They won't hang in there. So what on earth is going on up here? Something up on the roof. I can't see what the hell it is. Sometimes I get a cat up there actually. Next door's cat gets up there and has a walk around. Right, where do we get to? So that's how cool it can get and how warm it can get. But quite honestly, it comes from elevations of 500 metres up to 1200 metres. That's quite a temperature range, so it's quite tolerant. And obviously, those that are growing lower down don't get such a cool winter. Those that are up the top end of that elevation probably get quite a cold winter. So it is quite tolerant. What it doesn't like is getting wet in the winter. Right, now that's how it grows in the wild. I make exceptions to that. You know me, I don't like following the books. Because when mine was going into winter, it was pushing out some new growths. And I thought, well, if it's going to grow, I need to keep it growing. I'm not going to lose those new growths and either stall them or they just stop. So I carried on watering and with a little bit of feed, but incredibly carefully. It got trickles of water with some feed, not soaking like I do this time of year. Quite honestly, when it's in active growth in the summer, you'd have a job to overwater it, but it still needs to get almost dry in between. So again, it's don't let it get soggy, that staying wet for long periods at a level where it can't use the water. I'd love to know what that is. Perhaps the roof's going to fall in a minute. That'll be fun. Right, so where do we get to? This is another one where it doesn't like still air. It likes good air movement. Places where it comes from tend to have a good airflow up the mountainside. So, you know, coming in off the sea and being pushed, being driven. You know, anywhere where you get monsoon rains, it ain't still. It moves. Otherwise, those clouds can't move up the mountainside and dump all their rain, basically. So good air movement for that one. Bordering on a draft, but not in a draft. So good air movement. Mine lives there. That's in the direct line of fire of that rotating fan. So it gets strong breeze, not much breeze. Strong breeze, not much breeze. So it's not in that permanent, you know, but good airflow. Where do we get to? The thing I will say with that is I think a lot of people are going to lose that in the winter if they're going to lose it at all. Because when it's actively growing, apart from getting it too much sun on it or something like that, you can't do a lot wrong with it. It's not going to like breaking down media. Most of the books and places you will read will recommend putting it in a pot and not mounting it. Whereas I like the control I've got on a mount for that winter period, especially if I'm trying to keep it growing when I haven't got any warmth. That's a fragile environment to maintain, and it's got rotten roots written all over it if you're not very, very careful. So that's that. It blooms in spring into summer. Well, as you can see, we're not far off Midsummer's Day and I've still got a bloom on mine. So that's that. The blooms are fragrant, but they don't fill a room. Delicately fragrant, I'd call it. And they're a sort of honey fragrance. I'm not very good at describing it. Lovely waxy blooms, substance to them, sturdy, nothing flimsy or wishy-washy about them. So that's Dendrobium senile. I've got to write that up without all the waffle to go in the newsletter. Well, it's easy to write without waffle because you just miss bits out, don't you? Right. This is not going to be too easy because, again, it could be long, but I'm going to keep it brief. Lyn Krauchi, I think that's pronounced, Krauchi, asked what my watering and feeding program is. Summed up by splitting my orchids into sets of orchids that have specific needs that are the orchids within the set will have very similar needs, but they're not exactly the same. So they're like an average. The first obvious set is the mounted orchids. They tend to be, like most orchids, they have a growing season and a season when they're not doing so much called winter here in the UK. Other countries, that might not apply. So, this is me in here in this part of the UK, south coast of the UK. So if we start in the spring, most things on mounts are coming into growth. That would coincide with the start of the wetter seasons in the various places they come from. Right up from monsoon seasons to just what's called the rainy season, when there's just a lot more rain around. Doesn't mean it rains every day, but it rains an awful lot more. So they get watered in spring through summer into autumn, depending on the weather. If we get a mild sunny autumn, you get sun on this glass, it's warm in here. So these don't see it as autumn. The only reason they know it's autumn is the days are shortening. That will slow them up to a degree, but if they've still got warmth, they'll carry on growing for a bit. So the end of the growing season for me is never a fixed point in time. Yeah. So during that season they get reasonable levels of feed. I don't normally give out feed levels, but my mounts during the growing season get fed at about 250 parts per million of my basic MSU fertiliser. They may get additives on top of that rather than as part of it. So if we were having what I call a growing spell where we've got pretty good weather and each day in here it's nice and warm, all the kit's on, the fans are going, the humidifiers keeping that up, nice growing feel to the place. If we get a few days like that, I'll feed up nearer the 250 mark. Now if I want to add calcium in there at 40 or 50 parts per million, I'm now up to 300. So I very rarely go above that, not for my mounts. They get fed almost every day. Now when we get a set of dull days, they'll miss a day where they won't get fed or watered. And at this time of year with that level of feeding, they get a flipping good flush, a good wash through about every fourth watering. So they still get a good flush. So that's one set, the mounts. And then we've got the holy clay pots, which are mainly Cattleya types with very few exceptions. There's a Dendrobium in one there, Latoria type, but apart from that it's mainly Cattleya types. And again, some Cattleya types put on their new growths in the winter, so you've got to go careful. But in the main, the holy clay pots are in there for a reason, because the plants that are in there need a fast wet dry cycle. And apart from a bare rooted plant, the fastest wet dry cycle is going to have clay, which takes moisture out of the media and then evaporates it. Yeah, they've got holes all over the place, so there's oodles of air, and they've only got large chunky bark. So that's as airy a mix as I can do. A lot of those plants would be okay in bits of lava rock, large bits of charcoal, inorganic stuff, rocks, anything you flipping like, as long as they get that fast wet dry cycle. But with bark, it holds some moisture for some time. Not too long though. So there's that set. Now they get watered about every 4 days. If we get a really warm spell consecutive, perhaps every 3rd day. We get a dull period, it might go to 5 days. And I feed those higher. They get fed at 300, 350 parts per million, so they get a higher level of feed. During the winter that drops right back. But I can't stop it completely because quite a few of my cattleyas will actually be growing in the winter. They won't grow as quick because they lose their heat and they lose their day length. So they will slow up, yeah, but they still grow. Some don't. Some cattleyas finish blooming or whatever and they have quite a rest before anything happens. Well, if the plant's not growing anything, no roots, no new growths and no spikes, and it hasn't got any blooms on it, what's it going to do with that feed then? So can I separate them out? No. I can't suddenly decide that out of all my holy clay pots, these two aren't going to get fed today. They either all get it or none of them do. So that's one set. Then I've got my cooler, shadier ones, things like Masdevallias Draculas. They don't get much food at all. They get more flushes than feeds. So they'll possibly get 2 or even 3 flushes followed by a low level feed. And this time of year, if it's warm, about every 3 or 4 days they get watered. They're heavy on the moss. They hold their moisture for quite a long time. Come the winter time, they'll often go 10 days without getting watered because they're not growing as much. Even though they do like it cool, they still slow down. Its day length comes down, you know, that affects them. And then all the other orchids are just what I call my ordinary pots, my other pots. And they're a bit of a mixture. It's probably mainly Oncidium types, but there's a few other things in there. There's a few Dendrobiums in pots. It's mainly Oncidium types. There's some Coelogenes. So there are a few oddities in. There's a Cymbidium, that lives out in the garden. Watering schedule for that, you look at the sky. My ordinary pots get fed around the same level as the mounts, quite honestly. Around 250 to 300 parts per million, growing season again. But there again, you can get Oncidiums that will grow through the winter, you know, and others that don't. So that's a rough idea of what goes on. Limited idea of what goes on. Ugh, I could talk for hours on that. And have done in the past. So you can always dig out an old video. Right, MaryBeth L, that's the channel name. I don't know what the L is. I don't know what the L's for. Yeah, there we go. Wanted to chat about the temperature and humidity and this sort of relationship. There is actually a rough formula. Come on, memory. Right, you all understand what the dew point is, yeah? Air can hold moisture, yeah? That's what humidity is all about. In the desert, there ain't a lot, so you'd have next to none, almost bone dry air. In the tropical rainforest, you're heading up towards 100%. But also in the cooler cloud forests, you're heading up to 100%. Yeah? But what actually happens, the dew point is the point at which the temperature drops. And as the temperature drops, the relative humidity climbs. When it reaches 100%, at whatever temperature that happens, because it depends where it started from, that's the dew point. That's when you get the morning dew, or condensation on your glass. It's when that 100% point hits. It's not a good idea to have that where your plants are growing because they're then wet. And the chances are it's cool because it normally happens as it cools down. But if you had, let's say you had 100% humidity at 10 degrees centigrade, you'd hit that condensation point. Now if you go from 10 degrees to 20 degrees centigrade, your relative humidity will go from 100% to 50%. Yeah? So it's about half for 10 degrees. It's a rough calculation, that's not science. But if the humidity level is not added to or subtracted from, then the warmer it gets, the lower the relative humidity gets. And that's where you start pumping in your humidity. Like when the temperature, when I get up in the morning, is say 15 degrees out here, my humidity will be 90-95% because it was pumped up the previous day and it hasn't got anywhere to go because no windows open in here. So there is a relationship there, but the warmer it gets, the lower the relative humidity reading is. The actual amount of humidity in the air may not have changed one little bit, but we tend to start adding it in to keep the reading the same. Yeah. So that's that one. Where are we now? Elain Reily asked an unusual question. Most people probably wouldn't even have thought about it. Is there such a thing as overbreeding? Too much going on, playing with the genetics of orchids, that it starts to mess them up? And the simple answer is yes. But it depends on what is getting a bit messed up, whether it really is bad news. You start hybridizing bifoliates and monofoliates in the Khatwah alliance, and you'll get a plant that doesn't know what to do. So it will put up a growth with 2 leaves, next time it'll only have 1 leaf, then it might have 2, it might even put up one with 3. It's confused because the genetics are a bit messed. That won't stop it blooming. However, on the blooming front, you can also get Khatwahs that, no matter how much calcium you chuck in, they chuck up a flower spike with 2 lovely blooms on that are 6 or 7 inches across and weigh about half a pound each. They will flop, which would not happen naturally. They've gone too far from the species and got too big for their boots. They can't hold themselves up without being staked. Now that should never happen. Yeah? The plant should always be able to support its blooms in the manner it has chosen. Bearing in mind some blooms are naturally pendulous. Draculas come out the bottom of the plant, straight down and hang down. So you've got those types of varieties. But yes, genetics can get messed up. I've seen an oncidium type grow a new pseudobulb out the top of a pseudobulb. That's messed up. It's not right. In its worst case, you'll get distortions on blooms that come and go, where the genetics are saying, I've got so much confusion going on here, I'm not quite sure what these blooms are supposed to be like. So it can get lost. You can also get pyloric blooms, which is like a natural genetic mutation. To such an extent it can be controlled and recreated. But I don't think you see many of those in the species world actually out in the wild. So it's genetics getting messed up. So yes, you can get genetic problems by messing about too much. An endearing term, overbreeding, but you can see what the point is. Right, here's a nice easy one. Laura Pointer wants to know what the new growths on Jenkinsii look like. Well, we'll have a look, shall we? I presume I've got some. Can't imagine that I haven't this time of year. Where are we then? Right. Quite honestly, they look like the normal growths, except they've got a bronzy tinge to the leaves. That's a new growth there. But they grow. There's a new growth there. There's a new growth there. There's a new growth there. They grow incredibly quickly, so it's difficult to show one just starting, because by the time it started, it's finished. But the main thing is the colour of the leaves. It tends to have a bronzy tinge. And then it matures to a nice shiny lighter green, and then the green darkens as it becomes fully mature. I'm just seeing if I can find one that's just starting to grow. The trouble is they come out anywhere. Anywhere, literally. I don't think I'm going to be able to find one that's just starting. There will be some. It's finding them. No, I can't. Oh, there's one. Ah, gotcha. Right, now can I get it on camera without breaking the one next to it? Now, the cane that I'm touching, the leaf that I'm touching, either side of it is a new growth. So there's one just there, just on the end of my finger, and there's another one just here on the end of my finger again. So whether you can see that clearly or not, I don't know, but there's one each side of this cane that I'm holding the leaf down on. So that's what they look like when they're just starting. Something like that. Not very easy to show actually, but those couple that I've just shown you that are just starting to grow, give them a couple of days, they'll be full size, or nearly full size. Once they start, they really push on quickly. And the last one for today. Some people may have heard me use the expression bloomed its head off in a derogatory manner, in other words, not in a nice way. Where's my name? Eric Khatwah, Khatwah, something like that, asked this. What did I mean by blooming its head off? The easy example is the mass-produced nobiles that are often a two-caned orchid, sometimes with half a cane where one's been chopped off, and they're in full bloom right down the length of those two canes. That's not natural. Yeah, it's been forced, heavily forced with trade type hormones, feed, perfect lighting, perfect heating, perfect difference between day and night, absolutely everything perfect, and it's been forced into being like that. And it will have bloomed its head off under that level of pressure that you can't do. So you buy it, and those blooms finished, and the poor old plant's got nothing left. It's totally exhausted, because at the point the buds started to open, it went off to be sold, and all that care stopped. So it managed to do its blooms out of the reserves it had, but there ain't a lot left. It's bloomed its head off, and sometimes they will take 6 months to even a year before they'll even attempt to put out a new growth. They're exhausted. So that's what I really mean. It's difficult for you to do it yourself because we haven't got those trade feeds and hormones, growth regulators and all those sort of things. We don't get access to that. But that's what I mean by it when I say it in a derogatory way. And it's normally following one that you've bought that's been pushed really hard with things that you can't get hold of, and then from the point it came out of the nursery to the point you bought it, it's had none of it. So all those blooms and everything have just drained the plant because there hasn't been any going in. It stopped at the point of coming out of the nursery. So that's what I mean by that expression. Now something like this could be deemed blooming its head off. I'm not sure it's in shot. That's blooming its head off, but in a nice way, because it's been done naturally. Yeah? So each cane has probably produced a bloom spike in every place it can. Yeah? So it's done well, but it's been done naturally with ordinary feeds and ordinary light levels and me. Ordinary. So that's what I really mean by blooming its head off. And it can leave a plant in a very delicate state as far as energy levels are exhausted. There's not a lot there. And a lot of people say, oh right, so it's done all its blooming and everything like that. I don't like the look of that media, I'll repot it. It's got nothing left to regenerate any roots. So that's the time you often lose your root system, especially on things that, like the store-bought Phalaenopsis. You know, get them out of their pot, you've got a big, plug, sphagnum plug, and all the roots inside there are dead. The ones around the outside don't look bad, and you think, oh that's okay, but you've now disturbed them, and the plant's got no reserves to really push itself on. And I mean, some of those mass-produced Phalaenopsis, they don't bloom for 2 years. They miss a year completely, and they don't grow any new leaves for some considerable time. And others, you get them home, and they just carry on as if they haven't left the nursery. That's in the genetics. If you go back to Phalaenopsis species, some of them are quite vigorous, and some of them really, really, really aren't. They very rarely grow a new leaf. There's one species, and maybe more, that if it gets adverse conditions, it'll dump its leaves. So you end up with a leafless plant. And in cultivation, they're very, very difficult to get to grow once they do that. So if you lose them, chances are you have lost them. In the wild, they can regenerate. Because again, their roots haven't been disturbed. They're still where they were. They've just had a hard time. They dump their leaves to survive. It's different. So it's coming on to rain now, so it sounds like a reasonable time. I'm going to have to go outside and find out what that thumping is, because it's worrying me. Because I don't believe it's on the roof, so where the hell is it? And it's pouring with rain now anyway. So thanks for dropping by. That's that set of questions. I now have none for next time. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Yeah. And keep them coming. I enjoy them. Occasionally I have to go and do a bit of work, to actually find the answer out. I'm normally okay because it relates mainly about my own plants, obviously. So, yeah, thanks for that, and see you next time.